Today we are talking about the history of the Obama years. We're joined with our special guest author of He Was Our Man in Washington. Good morning, Owen.
Hey, good morning, Kristi. How's it going?
I'm doing well. Now, you are a social historian, a political activist, and a writer. This is your first book, is that correct?
That's right.
So why did you have the inspiration to write a book based on Obama?
Oh, good question. So I guess for a lot of people with politics recently, it started with the 2016 election. I was a little bit, shall we say, surprised at the outcome, as I suspect many people were. I think even Republicans were a little bit flummoxed that Trump managed to win. So I, being a, graduate with a history degree, I've loved history since I was a kid. I kind of figured, well, maybe a place to start with trying to find some answers is the recent past, the previous administration. Maybe I can find some answers there as far as why we got the president that we had in 2016-17. So as I was researching that, I, got further and further into the U.S. past and ended up being less interested in the immediate election and more interested in kind of Obama's place in the American narrative, in the larger picture of American history. So that's kind of what the book ended up becoming.
So when you did your research on Obama's administration, his time in office, what were some of the key things that you discovered that led up to Trump's election and what he focused on, as well as the crossover to our current Biden administration?
I think the key word here with Obama is continuity. Right, he ran on a platform of hope and change, but ultimately what his administration managed to deliver was, by and large, more of the same. Right, so we're talking about, let's get out of Iraq. Well, that didn't really happen. And that's not to say that's all his fault, but it's something that his administration wasn't exactly able to accomplish. Afghanistan was still a festering wound by the time he left office. We're still fighting the war on terror is one of the big examples. He expands the war on terror in Africa, for instance, lots of drone campaigns, special operations, a lot of training local soldiers and things like that to fight African, mostly Muslim terrorists. So that's very, similar kind of continuity with the previous administration. Economically, same thing. He continued with the bank bailouts, with the financial bailouts for large corporations, whereas not so much for the little guy. The administration had all the excuses in the world for why they couldn't help individual homeowners, but they were continuing the policies that had begun under Bush as far as bailing out larger institutions. With healthcare, he promised that healthcare was going to be treated like a human right, and instead we got a more market-based solution. We're going to stick with private insurance companies whose job is not to provide healthcare, but is to make money, right? Very much more of the same. So when you have 8 years of that, despite 2 campaigns of hope and change, people get a little mad and a little bit confused and a little bit desperate, right? The economic situation, the economy was improving under Obama, but it was a very slow recovery. A lot of jobs were not good jobs. You can talk about, well, we added X number of jobs to the economy, but if you went from good paying auto jobs with union membership to I'm a cashier at Dollar General or Walmart, Walmart in many states is the largest private employer. Those jobs are not usually very well paying. They don't have very good benefits. They don't have very good hours, etc. So that was a lot of the economic quote-unquote recovery under Obama, was those kinds of more precarious employment. You're working part-time. You're working in the gig economy. You're an Uber driver. You have to work 50 hours a week just to make ends meet. So there was a lot of economic desperation, especially among the lower and working class, during Obama's 8 years in power. So you take all this, what I in the book refer to as neoliberalism. That's kind of the idea that markets can solve most, if not all, of our problems. So, maybe like under Obama, he recognized government has to step in here and there to correct market imperfections, an overheated housing market or too much investor confidence. But for the most part, markets can regulate themselves. And so the result of that kind of policy making is that people who are already rich benefit more, because that's what markets do. They tend to benefit people that already have the money, since it's a money-based institution. So by the time Trump comes on the scene, you have a lot of angry, desperate, confused people. You combine that with the fact that there are still plenty of racists in the country, and Trump managed to tap into that racism and this kind of understandable mistrust of the government. I mean, going at least as far back as Vietnam and Watergate, there have been legitimate reasons to mistrust the government for things, right? That doesn't mean it's some kind of, 100% evil institution, but there are reasons to be skeptical of any powerful entity, right? But Trump kind of takes that, warps it through kind of a racist conspiratorial lens, and drums up all of this, very cultish kind of support for his brand, essentially, because that's what Trump is. He's not really a businessman so much as he is a brand ambassador for himself. It's not like he owns a factory and produces something of value. What he produces is more of his image, right? So that's, I think, a lot of what got us to Trump is the fact that Obama came in on a high, hope and change, we're going to radically remake the system. His administration, partly through his own policies and partly through the limitations of the presidency, because the presidency is not a radical institution. It wasn't built that way. So you combine more conservative policies with a more conservative institution, plus the racist backlash to Obama, and you get someone like Trump.
Owen, we live in a conservative area here in the United States, and when Obama became president and he started talking about health care reform, Obamacare, there was a lot of criticism, there was a lot of fear here in our area about what that would look for as private insurances were concerned and things like that. And then you had people who were very excited about it on the other side, looking for more affordable care and care for all. And so it seemed to me, and I'm not a political expert by any shape or form, that this was very polarizing. And Obama really didn't do a great job about bringing that together and getting the support of conservatives. What could he have done differently so that every American could come together and really look at reforming healthcare for a positive change for everyone?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Obama, from the research that I've done, he tried very hard to reach across the aisle. A lot of Obamacare itself is built on conservative Republican ideas. The whole idea of the individual mandate, which we don't have anymore, thanks to the Trump and the Republican Congress, for better or worse. But the individual mandate, this idea that you'd either have to have insurance or pay a fine, that comes from Romney Care, right? What Romney instituted in Massachusetts. Obviously, Mitt Romney is still a high-profile Republican, not as conservative, I think, as some of Trump's Republican supporters would like. But especially in 2008, 2009, he's ahead of the pack in the conservative realm there. Other ideas too were pulled straight from the conservative playbook. The whole idea of having these kind of marketplaces where people could buy different health insurances. That comes from, I think it was the Heritage Foundation in the mid-1990s, early 1990s. That was something that they put forward as an alternative to what the Clinton administration was trying to push forward at the time, because Clinton had tried healthcare reform to notoriously disastrous results in the early 1990s. So, and just the very idea of continuing to rely on these private insurance companies, that's not a radical thing, because you're not upending the whole system. And Democrats thought the same thing, at least the powerful ones in Congress. So in the Senate, I think it was Waxman who was one of the main guys that had started healthcare reform negotiations. He came right out and said, we're not trying to upend the system. We're trying to keep the things that people already like. Because, if you have a good job, especially with union benefits, your private insurance is probably pretty good. So there, even on the very policy level, Obama did try and reach across the aisle and get some of these conservative, Republican, more market-based ideas into the bill. He did not do a lot to defend the public option, which is what a lot of progressives really wanted. This idea that if we're going to have health insurance, we should have a government-funded version of health insurance so everyone can have equal access to the same kind of insurance. He basically let the Democrats in Congress gut that pretty quickly, because the Senate was not having any of it. The Senate Democrats did not want anything to do with the public option. Now, part of that was because Joe Lieberman was very much against it, and they needed his one vote to clear the filibuster. Now, outside the policy realm, I do think the Obama administration could have done more to reach out to actual voters and make them understand, hey, the message you're being sold is not true. This is not a radical bill. A lot of these ideas come from your own party. This is something that you shouldn't have to fear. But I think partly because there was kind of a racist backlash, but partly because we live in very partisan, polarized times. I mean, you can see that back with Clinton and the impeachment that he had to go through late in his presidency. Very politically polarized ever since the end of the Cold War, because now we don't have the communists to unite everyone together, both parties. So it was a tall order for Obama. I think he tried. I think to me, I'm more on the progressive side of things. I think he tried way too hard to get Republican votes because it didn't actually accomplish very much. Almost no Republican voted for most of his domestic legislation, even though he tried very hard to get their votes. But yeah, definitely his administration didn't do a great job messaging that fact to the American public.
Oh, and we need to take a news break here in just a second, but oftentimes it seems to me that after the conclusion of the president's administration, after that comes to light, all of the possible successes and failures from that administration. It's oftentimes, as we're seeing now, it's years that we see what actually occurred with policy change during that presidency. And so we had a question, there was a caller about some of the failures that were attributed to the Obama administration. And when we come back, I want you to answer, how much did you find to be a result of obstruction from either the Republican leadership or the Democratic leadership that ended up resulting in these failures and ultimately not the change that Obama had originally wanted when he came into office?
All right.
And this morning, we are talking about the Obama years with author Owen Symes. He is a social historian and has written a book about the term of Obama and how it corresponds to the Trump administration and to the current Biden administration. Before the commercial break, I said that we had a question from one of our listeners about possible obstructions, blocks, that kind of prevented Obama from making the changes that he claimed he was going to make when he went into office. What were some of the things that you found, Owen, when you did your research for this book?
Yeah, so the two things that come immediately to mind are Guantanamo Bay and climate change. So one of the things that Obama promised he was going to do first year in office was close Guantanamo Bay, which, if anyone doesn't know, it's a part of the island of Cuba that the U.S. took during the Spanish-American War, and we've never given it back. Since the revolution in Cuba, they haven't accepted any lease payments for it because they think it's part of their sovereign territory, which they probably have a point there. But the U.S. continues to have military installation on Guantanamo Bay, and after 9/11, the Bush administration decided that was a good place to put terror suspects. Because they didn't consider them actual prisoners of war, affected by the Geneva Conventions. So that's been a sore point among liberals and progressives for a long time. At one point, the conditions there were very brutal. They're a little bit better now, after there was some public backlash about that. But understandably, many people did not like the fact that we had all these terror suspects kind of in indefinite detention. We weren't really sure what to do with them and how to handle them, and there was a lot of brouhaha about that. So Obama came in and said, okay, going to sign an executive order. We're going to go ahead and get Guantanamo closed. Very quickly, Congress, and this was mostly Republican, but bipartisan, because there were some conservative Democrats who felt the same way. They didn't want anything to do with moving these prisoners onto any other piece of U.S. property. They didn't want to necessarily repatriate them to countries that might not be able to keep tabs on them or handle them or what have you. So very quickly, the Obama administration found itself in kind of a quandary there, because some of these guys were very low level. It wasn't even clear sometimes if they had even done anything wrong, because the Bush administration kind of hoovered up a lot of these people with very little due process, which, in a time of war might be understandable, but once things calm down, maybe you can take stock and try and figure out who actually needs to be there, if nothing else. So the Obama administration suddenly found itself kind of roadblocked in that respect because they had no place to put these people because Congress said, no, you can't put them anywhere else that we have jurisdiction over, essentially. And other countries were understandably either reticent to take them in or in places like Yemen, taking these guys and putting them back in their home countries, it was almost impossible to keep tabs on them because those home country governments were in various states of chaos, disrepair, decay. So late in his administration, more kind of grassroots pressure pushed him to do more. And so he did ultimately drastically reduce the number of inmates in Guantanamo, but he never actually was able to close it. So I would chalk that up to at least partially the result of partisan congressional roadblock. And the other one is climate change, which he tried to pass legislation to deal with early in his first term. Couldn't get it done in and among healthcare and the Recovery Act. Congress couldn't figure out a way to kind of get that deal situated and to his desk. Especially conservative Democrats in fossil fuel producing states were very reticent. Understandably so. Their economy is very largely based, sometimes West Virginia, for instance, on coal production. So and he wasn't going to get any Republican votes for a climate change thing because the Republicans oftentimes don't even admit that it's a problem that needs to be solved. So under the Democratic-controlled Congress in his first term, he couldn't get climate change passed. And then once the Republicans took the House first and then ultimately the Senate, there was no way he was going to get any kind of climate change legislation passed through Congress. Now, he did manage to get the U.S. to sign on to the Paris Climate Accord. Now, how much good that's done is very debatable, especially, and this is something that Obama ran into a lot during the latter two-thirds of his administration. He increasingly had to rely on executive order, executive action, things that were outside the legislative process to get the things done that he wanted because Congress was so adamantine in its resistance to him. The problem with that, of course, is that for any kind of long-term change in the U.S. political system, you really need legislation to hammer that home and to get that done. Because executive order, as we saw with Trump coming into office, you can just reverse that stuff pretty quickly if you know what you're looking for. Whereas legislation is a lot harder to override or repeal.
Oh, and how is the current Biden administration influenced by the policies and ideals that he supported while he was Obama's VP?
Pretty heavily, I would say. Right off the bat, comes immediately to my mind is Biden's stance on the idea of Medicare for all. Now, he said during the campaign that he would veto Medicare for all legislation if it came to his desk. And I think the reason for that, ultimately, is that part of Biden's reputation rests on the success or failure of the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act ultimately rests on private insurance companies. So if you have Medicare for all, that guts the private insurance industry, which to my mind is a win because they're basically economic vampires as far as I'm concerned, not producing anything of value themselves. But for Biden, they're an integral part of one of Obama's two signature pieces of legislation. And since Biden, won the Democratic primary, primarily, I think, as a result of his ties to Obama, he has a lot to lose if that legislation is overturned or replaced. Same thing with foreign policy. So we saw it very clearly, I think, in Biden's rhetoric, especially in his inaugural address and things like that, that he very much wants to continue Obama's pivot towards Asia and specifically China. So one of the things that Obama tried to do as his second term really got going especially was to get away from the morass in the Middle East that George W. Bush had kind of gotten us into and pivot American foreign policy muscle towards where Obama thought it really mattered, which was our number two competitor, China. Obviously, under Trump, that was sporadically ramped up with the trade war, very haphazardly done. Trump wasn't very good at kind of long-term strategic planning, that kind of thing. But in that sense, at least, with the trade war, that was kind of a bellicose continuation of something Obama had started. And now Biden, I think, is combining the two and pushing that forward. So under Obama, the pivot towards China was not very bellicose in rhetoric. There was very much this idea that we can have amicable competition, maybe check China where they get out of line, but it wasn't supposed to be a conflict necessarily. At least that's how Obama's rhetoric framed it. Trump obviously was much more bellicose, and now under Biden, so far at least, his rhetoric towards China has been very bellicose as well. Specifically referring to them as an authoritarian regime. Same with Russia. And that there is this almost a new Cold War. The U.S., instead of the U.S. versus the USSR, it's the U.S. versus these authoritarian regimes, right? And in that sense, Biden is continuing the same kind of what they used to call neoconservative foreign policy that Bush had done, with his axis of evil back in 2002. And that's something that the Democrats and the Republicans, at least on the foreign policy realm, very much seem to agree on, despite the fact that they often quibble about small differences. Under Obama, the Republicans were very angry that he refused to immediately call the Benghazi attack a terror attack. That kind of small quibble, it took Obama an extra week or two to call it a terrorist attack, and then he did, and then he expanded the war on terror in Africa. But Republicans, instead of looking at the actual policy decisions, sending more weapons to African countries and more training and more special operations and more drone strikes, they looked at the just the rhetoric, and even then just the initial rhetoric. So that's something that, even though Republicans don't like to admit, they actually have a lot of agreement with these mainstream Democrats. And so that's something that Biden has continued. That's something that he's continuing from Obama, who continued it from Clinton. There's a lot of continuity with these guys. They're not as much hope and change as I think their campaign rhetoric would lead you to believe.
Owen, this is your first book. He Was Our Man in Washington. Are you planning on writing another book?
Yeah, I'm trying to piece together something on the history of U.S. policing. So obviously, during Obama's time, there was a lot of discussion about the role that U.S. police should play with the Ferguson protests and things like that. The levels of police brutality and how racism plays into that and what have you. That's I think, a big failure of his administration, that he didn't directly address that enough. But again, as president, especially with a hostile Congress, there's only but so much you can do anyways. So given the benefit of the doubt there a little bit. But, obviously the whole debate around U.S. policing has not gone away. Last year it was as heated as it's ever been. So I thought I would take a look at various aspects of that, how police are viewed in media, how that influences how we think about the police, what kind of tactics they've used over the years, why different police institutions have originated in the United States. So just as an example, the first U.S. state police agency in Pennsylvania, so circa like 1900, 1910, they grew out of and were heavily influenced by the police that we used in the Philippines to crush the insurgency and the nationalist aspirations of the Filipino people, what they called the Philippine Constabulary. So it was white officers and Philippine police, basically, and they went around and crushed whatever local resistance to American rule was there. So we took the lessons that we learned from our Philippine adventure and applied it to our own policing methods in Pennsylvania. So I thought those kinds of things are really interesting to me, how these institutions develop. Because we did, for most of human history, we haven't had organized policing. These things have had to develop and be created. So it very much interests me how those institutions got started and then how that history influences how they're currently operating. So that's what I'm trying to work on now.
Oh, and that sounds exciting. If people want to learn more about your book and pick up a copy, where can they find out that information?
Easiest place to go is John Hunt Publishing, so JOHN, huntpublishing.com, and then you can just search for my book there. He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. Just to be clear with that title, that's a quote from a financial executive. He was our man in Washington. So just an illustration of where Obama stood as far as these financial guys were concerned. They thought he was on their team, right? You can follow me on Twitter at Owen_Symes, SYMES, or follow me on Facebook at OwenDD Symes.
Well, thank you so much, Owen, for being with us today. We hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thanks, Kristi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.